everyone, and welcome to the Massey Dialogues. Thank you very much for joining us today. The topic for our conversation today is Imaginative Distancing, Our Reading Lives in Pandemic Times. Our featured speaker is Professor Randy Boyagoda, and we will also be joined by Kyle Wyatt, who is Editor-in-Chief of the Literary Review of Canada, and Stephanie Redekop, who is a Massey College Junior Fellow and a English Department PhD candidate. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the land on which Massey College and the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and study on this land. My name is Kate Frank, and I'll be hosting our conversation today. I'm a second-year junior fellow at Massey College and also a second-year PhD student in the Department of English at the University of Toronto, where my research focuses on women's walking in 18th century and Romantic British literature. Very briefly, before we get started, just to introduce the concept of the Massey Dialogues, if you haven't watched one of these before, this series was launched in March 2020 by Massey College principal Nathalie Desrosiers, and it's an online salon discussion series featuring experts and scholars from our wonderful community, which can be experienced and enjoyed from one's own home and shared online. The Massey Dialogues are designed to embrace the very essence of our college and community: highly informed, intergenerational, and interdisciplinary discourse. Further information about the dialogue series can be found on the Massey website, and the recorded live streams of the events are available to watch on the Massey YouTube channel. Please use the YouTube chat function if you're watching the live stream today to send us any questions that you have for the panel, and we will discuss some of these later in our conversation. We're really looking forward to hearing from you. So our featured speaker today is Professor Randy Boyagoda, who is Professor of English at the University of Toronto, where he's also served as principal of St. Michael's College since 2016. He begins a 5-year term as Vice Dean Undergraduate, Faculty of Arts and Sciences this summer, and is also an incoming Senior Fellow at Massey College. A novelist and critic, he is author of 5 books, most recently Original Prin, which was named a Globe and Mail Best Book and New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. He contributes essays and opinions to a variety of publications, including the New York Times, the UK Financial Times, the Walrus, and the Globe and Mail. He hosts a literary podcast for the Toronto Public Library and is a books columnist for CBC Radio. He lives in the East End of Toronto with his wife, 4 daughters, and a Weimaraner puppy. So Professor Boyagoda, thank you very much for joining us. I wondered if we could start off by talking about how you define this term, imaginative distancing.
Sure. Well, actually, let me begin by just thanking Principal Desrosiers for inviting me to be part of this timely and important set of dialogues, which really do demonstrate the flexibility and thoughtfulness of Massey in responding to the moment we're in and finding a way to continue exactly these kinds of dialogues, modeling them in intergenerational ways, in ways that engage the academic world, the public world. At the same time, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be part of the Massey community and likewise to join you all in this. The term imaginative distancing is, I imagine, to everyone listening right now, kind of obvious enough on physical distancing, social distancing, the ways in which we're told over and over again about these defining features of getting through our current period of the pandemic. And it occurred to me that the consequences of physical distancing are not just physical. They are psychological, they are interpersonal, and then in ways perhaps that are more unexpected, they are imaginative. That in a way, the very function of our reading lives has been, I think, if we take a moment and reflect ourselves, each in our own way, our reading lives have been also profoundly impacted by the pandemic. And mindful, not least the significance of the Massey Book Club series. I know there's a big event for it next week involving Margaret Atwood and Susan Swan, but just how important books and reading life is to the Massey community, and indeed to anyone else interested in a dialogue like this. This strikes me as a great occasion to just think a little bit about what imaginative distancing means, what reading means in a time of social distancing. So thought maybe as a way into our larger conversation, take a few moments and reflect on this idea of imaginative distance. I want to do so in three contexts: as a reader myself, primarily, as an observer of other people's reading lives, and then finally as a writer, and the ways in which the pandemic has affected my kind of imaginative life in each of those contexts. So if you think about it, one thing we take for granted, perhaps, when it comes to our reading lives would be that there is a supple and active two-way relationship between our reading lives and our thinking and acting lives. And this is true in kind of any given number of contexts. All of these things are called into question by a pandemic moment, especially given the constraints that are placed on us by COVID, right? This idea that we are distanced in the way that we are, and also the profound uncertainty associated with this event. As tragic and terrible as these things tend to be, terrorist events, major weather events, we can understand those in a way, right? We can understand the immediate consequences, the short, medium, and long-term effects of an or a major geopolitical event, a protest, any sorts of things that can kind of impact and inform us. So much of the challenge, I think, of COVID has been the uncertainty of it. And that uncertainty has, in a sense, led us to kind of reimagine, I think, our relationship to books, to our imaginary lives. Under normal conditions, I think it's fair to say that our relationship to reading is really more or less modeled by what Thoreau does with Walden. So if we think about something like Walden, one of the most famous lines of it is that idea that he has gone to the woods because he wants to live deliberately. But in fact, what Walden really does is model what it means to read and write deliberately. You do not go to Walden to live in Walden, right? Whether it's to move this camp, as it were, on Emerson's land in the mid-19th century, or indeed in turning to the book. You don't spend your entire life there. The point is it's a refuge and a place for recovery, for restoration, for development that prepares you for return, okay? So my basic premise, I think, is that we think in normal terms of our reading lives as places of refuge that are designed for return. What are we returning to, though, in a pandemic moment when we're leading rather confined lives? As a reader, and I reflected on this for the Globe and Mail in an essay that was published a couple of weeks ago, I was amazed that when this uncertainty first set in, I was desperate to read only things related to COVID. It struck me as some kind of strange responsibility on my part, that it was kind of wrong, even decadent and irresponsible to read anything that didn't have to go on the idea of reading as refuge. Soon enough, and I suspect this would be as true for Kyle, for Stephanie, and for you, Kate, and for everyone else listening, I got sick of COVID. I was sick of listening and reading about COVID and becoming a kind of amateur epidemiologist and understanding R factor. I was just tired of all of it. And then I remembered, oh yeah, I have this thing, this imagination. I can find a way out, and that's through reading. And then what happened, this kind of vicious circle set in, where in my reading life, I found myself fixated on pandemic-related matters. Whether, right now, one of the books I've read more recently is Hilary Mantel's latest part of the Cromwell trilogy. And there's so much going on in it's called The Mirror and the Light. I think it's called The Mirror and the Light, in this third novel in the big Cromwell trilogy. And I kept noticing, right, to anxiety about plagues that would just be built into kind of 16th, 17th century English life. And I thought, well, how much am I missing as a result of only fixating? And it became even true when it came to Camus, right? Everyone's guide to the pandemic seems to be listening to the plague or reading the plague. And I hated it. because it seemed to me like a kind of a profound deforming of the purpose of our imaginary lives, that I was only listening, and in this case listening because we couldn't get a copy, listening to Camus' The Plague with my family in order to have something confirmed, right? Like, what a terrible use of the imagination to confirm what I already think and am worried about, as opposed to, again, refuge, release, restoration, a reframing of something. None of that was happening. I had better luck with Boccaccio. I've been reading the Decameron every now and then, and I found that especially the prologue to the Decameron, it kind of models, as far as I'm concerned, what it means to respond to a pandemic situation, in that we turn to stories as forms of disciplined escape. You're committing to something, you're going to read a tale, you're going to tell a tale, you're going to share something, but in so doing, you're not kind of giving up on the world around you. You're also not kind of giving in to everything about the world around you, but you're understanding this as a period of respite, a necessary period of respite. And so in a disciplined way, you prepare there, again, for what? By way of Walden, for return, right? That's the key, is return. And to have our imaginations open and capable of helping us get there before we get there, as it were, seems to me important. That's me as a reader. As an observer, I'll notice maybe a couple of things. One, and I kind of made a snark about this in that Globe essay, Camus has been reduced to a sturdy peg for 1 million columns, seems to me, and I'm really curious in chatting afterwards with Kyle about just how the burden of coverage works in these times. You find a kind of, in my observation of reading culture these days, is really a playing out of that earlier sense I had about how the pandemic was infecting my imagination and related decisions. Either it's all about COVID, or it has nothing to do with COVID, and then I feel guilty for reading it. Maybe I should go back to find something about COVID. The in-between recently was a long essay that Orhan Pamuk, Nobel laureate, wrote for the New York Times, maybe 2 Sundays ago. He apparently is in the midst of writing a novel set in the early 20th century Turkey that involves a response to a pandemic situation. And he was reflecting, across literature and culture, different cultures and religious traditions, as Pamuk can, like few others, on all the many ways that his own reading and writing lives are being informed and impacted by COVID. That was a nice kind of in-between for me, because I was reading the Sunday paper, I was reading the op-ed page, so I didn't feel like I was only reading, a decadent book review, but at the same time, it was a publicly facing, publicly engaged set of questions about the relationship of the imagination, of art, of storytelling, to the fraught pressures around us with COVID. I'll also note that as an observer, now I'm just thinking in more local terms with my family, ambition gone wrong. We're all facing this radically wrong idea that somehow living at home frees up time. And here's your chance for kind of great ambitious reading. And so I'm thinking about all the many ways that you set up these ambitious ideas for what you're going to read now that we're all at home, and it doesn't work out. The one exception is one of my daughters. She is 6. Oh my gosh, I'm going to get in so much trouble if she ever sees this. She's no longer 6. She's going to be close to 8 by the end of 2020. Anyway, she's 7. That was the issue. She's 7. She's in between these. She is plowing through Enid Blyton books. A couple of summers ago, I bought a whole bookcase of a whole case of Enid Blyton works, and she's discovered them randomly, and she's just going through one after the other, and she's glorying in all the time she has for her reading life these days. So that that's a good one that I certainly see as an observer, but otherwise I just see a lot of failed ambition, right? A lot of big books. At last, I'm going to read this, and then you're just tired. You're tired of using your eyes in various ways. You don't want to spend all this time, which I'd love to hear more from Kyle about. As a writer, now I speak here in terms as a writer. I'm mindful that Kate and Stephanie, you have your own writing responsibilities and burdens these days as doctoral students. I'm in the midst of revising a novel set in the near future, set in the United States at a Dante amusement park in an opioid-ravaged small town in Indiana, and it's set in the near future. And I realized that I had to find a way, because this is a novel where I made the decision to engage with the moment we're in, contemporary life. I made the decision that I had to kind of reimagine how COVID would impact the world of this novel, which is set in the near future. My doing so requires me not to simply kind of try to write a real-time, revise in real time in response to COVID. That's stupid, and it'll really limit me. I think Imaginative kind of rewrote parts of the novel as a kind of post-COVID moment. So it's post-plague literature in a sense. It's finished, and now we're living in the aftermath of. And so for me, and this is maybe how I'll bring all of this together, that was a kind of moment that was liberating to, as we all want to do, whether as readers, writers, or otherwise, we all want to imagine a moment after COVID. And so as a writer, I found myself kind of seized with this opportunity to think through what would it look like after COVID. No matter how it plays out, what would I want to imagine about what life would be like, in the moment afterwards? And so that was, kind of a nice moment. And I want to just maybe end with the following reflection and look forward to the conversation. If in many ways you find yourself kind of fixated on reading, for pandemic purposes, right? So that you've kind of lost all imaginative distance in a way. Paradoxically, the very thing that's supposed to be as open and free as possible, you've completely confined and closed with this obsession. There's another version of it, and it has to do with some things that are unexpectedly moving these days in our reading lives. And I'd love to hear if you're finding these as well. I recently read a novel called The Index of Self-Destructive Acts. It's a new novel by the editor of Harper's Magazine, Chris Beha. I was reviewing it and reading it in that context, so it's kind of a professional effort in some ways. And it's a neat historical novel set in 2000. And so, you're reading, and part of the satisfaction of reading that book is it's a contained story. That period is already over. We know how that story ends, at least historically, because it's delimited to 6 months in the year 2009, more or less. But what was most striking for me about that book wasn't thinking, oh, look at this, a time before COVID, blah, blah, blah. It was the ordinary moments that really caught me. So there's a sequence where two characters go to the grocery store, and they're just chatting in a grocery store. And I was moved by that with deep longing, because we can't just go to the grocery store. We're so self-conscious about those things now. And then I thought, well, in many ways is redeemed reading for me. That was my moment of restoration and refuge. What do we expect when we're reading? The unexpected, right? To be open to the unexpected. If we're reading in pandemic ways, all we want is confirmation. But when a book captures you in a way that you weren't expecting, so what moved me in Chris Beha's novel, sure, there's lots of great stuff about family life, about betrayal, loyalty. No, it was two characters going to a grocery store. And that caught me in a way that I wasn't expecting, which is exactly what we want in our imaginary lives. That's where you see kind of the beautiful openness and territory of the imagination really being taken up by something. That's what I see as the goods of imaginative distancing in pandemic times. So those are my opening remarks, and now I look forward to a conversation.
Thank you so much. So much there to hopefully we can come back and pick up on as we talk together. But as you're saying, this kind of the fixation, and you described it as kind of a vicious circle almost of getting just imaginatively locked into only being able to think about the current situation. But then on the other side of that coin, maybe the opportunity for things being moving in new ways. And something that you talked about in your Globe and Mail essay as well was pieces in what you're reading sort of jumping off the page in a different way than maybe would have happened before if you've been reading some of those things 2 months ago, 3 months ago, a year ago, noticing things, feeling things in a new way. I also wanted to ask you just briefly something that you touched on a couple times in what you said today and also in the Globe and Mail piece about new forms of maybe kind of, we could call them communal reading. that are coming out of this. You described, listening to the book tape with your family, talking about these things together, even something like the Decameron, which is all about sharing stories, telling stories to each other, not reading just as a individual, self-isolated in that sense thing, but as a communal experience, as something that we can do to bring ourselves together. I was wondering, if you had any thoughts on that kind of sharing aspect of reading, and maybe the role that that's playing right now, and how does that enter into these experiences of reading and observing and writing that you've been describing?
I think it's a great question. I'm smiling to myself because my wife is just observing that she has a new book club that she's part of that starts in 2 hours, and she hasn't done the reading for it. And she was observing that, pandemic or otherwise, the cliche of book clubs, right? That you end up having the Merlot, but you never actually ever end up doing the reading. It remains true even in pandemic times, right? No matter what. I think we're living a kind of strange version of the Benedict Anderson moment. Benedict Anderson famously wrote Communities back in 1953, in which he identified the act of reading a newspaper as a kind of a nation making moment. That you could be in Fredericton, you could be in Vancouver, and you could be in Oshawa, and you're all reading the same article and sense that you're reading it at the same time, more synchronously in the morning, let's say with your morning coffee or something, and that this was a recognition of shared community, to be self-aware of that, right? In the context of news, let's say. I think we've certainly built on that. Things like Canada Reads, obviously, our book clubs in lots of different ways. But I think there really is right now a more intentional awareness that the wonderful solitary act of reading can benefit from doing it with others. Whether you're doing it side by side reading different books, or whether we're kind of in a sense all on the same page because we're all sitting in the same situations these days. So I don't think suddenly there's a new kind of reading community. I think it's always been with us in a lot of ways, but rather there's a new appreciation about it and a new intention informing our acts of communal reading.
Thank you. So I'd like to bring in Kyle Wyatt now. Kyle is a senior resident at Massey College and editor-in-chief of the Literary Review of Canada. He holds a doctorate in English literature from the University of Toronto. Kyle, there were a couple of sort of specific questions about, the burden of coverage and what it means to be someone publishing work for others to read at this particular moment. So I wondered if you wanted to jump in with any of your responses to those questions.
Sure. In, I think, mid-December, I received a pitch from Jessica Wolfe, who was a junior fellow at Massey around the same time that I was. And she wanted to review a book that was coming out from the University of Toronto Press about epidemics. And she thought it might be interesting because there was this kind of newsy hook, because there was this kind of emerging thing that was happening in China, and that'd be the hook for this book, right? And she was thinking it would be short. It'd be like a 900-word piece. And then she started working on it, and then after the new year, it became a little longer. Could she have a bit more space? And it became a bit longer, and eventually we ran it in the April issue. And there was this real kind of anxiety of, are we saying too much? Are we saying too little? Are we going to say anything that's going to be wildly out of date by the time it comes out? And then it was just kind of like this moment where it was just the tip of the iceberg. And now, like, everything that anyone sends me is about the pandemic or related to the pandemic. And there's that tension of, as Randy said, like the pandemic finding its way into everything. Do you allow it to find its way into everything? Do you stop and say, well, this book about spiders has nothing to do with the pandemic, but the writer has found a way to make it about the pandemic? It weighs on my mind for sure. I think the best email I received yesterday was the first draft of a review, and the writer sent it to me, and she said, there's no reference to the pandemic, so this can run anytime. It was like this great little surprise because it was the only thing that I'd read in, weeks that had not somehow made a reference to the world the way that it was, or the world the way it will be after this moment. So it's definitely factors into everything that I'm doing right now.
Thank you very much. And I think I'll just bring Stephanie Redekop, who's the fourth person on our panel today, in as well, and then the four of us can talk together. So Stephanie is a PhD candidate in the Department of English and the Center for Jewish Studies. She's a junior fellow at Massey College and the co-director of the American Literature Research Collaborative at the University of Toronto. And her research focuses on the relationship between the literary essay and public crisis discourse in 1960s America. Stephanie, I was just wondering about your responses to what's been said so far, and as PhD students, candidates, were caught in, both as readers and then also working on our writing. And so how does that connect to your experience or your work during this time?
Yeah, well, one thing I was thinking about when Randy was mentioning the idea of, going to the woods to live deliberately and deliberate reading during this time. And for me, that's actually probably been the biggest wrench thrown by COVID into my reading life, is that all the books I wanted to read are in boxes in Toronto or in the Toronto libraries, and I'm quarantined here in Vancouver, without the books I'd planned to read. And so that sort of quality of unexpected reading, unplanned reading, has been something that I haven't done in a very long time, but now I've just found myself sort of reading whatever I find lying around the house, whether it's, borrowing a book from my brother or reading a book that a friend lent me over Christmas that I never got to. So just, I think on a very literal level, I've been reading in an unplanned and genuinely exploratory way. And something kind of unexpected that I've found through that is reading in an unplanned way also means reading without the burden of expectation. And so I've found that to be quite imaginatively liberating, and trying to lean into that rather than the anxiety of, oh no, I don't have the books I need to do my research. The other aspect related, as you were saying, to our kind of PhD work is we've talked a lot, I guess, so far about fiction and novels and the way that creates imaginative opportunities. But because I spend so much of my time reading essays and articles, I've sort of been thinking about in what sense the nonfiction texts can help us imaginatively during this time. So I'm really interested to hear kind of what people think about that in the conversation. I was interested to hear Randy talking about the Pamuk essay he was reading, or Kyle's talking about the different essays and reviews he's been thinking through. I've found kind of the ability to connect with the thought of a writer, an essayist, processing whatever their circumstances are as kind of an unexpected imaginative resource as well. I think we're often encouraged or trained in our kind of new critical kind of literary education that we're not reading in order to connect with another consciousness necessarily. But that's actually something that I've found an unexpected aspect of the imaginative distancing is amid social distancing. How does imagination allow us to kind of draw near to someone or something as we're thinking through things? So that's been another thing that I've been thinking a lot about.
Thank you, Stephanie. The question of reading and writing as processing. And Kyle, does that kind of come into some of what you're saying as well about what you're having pitched to you at this point, what you're choosing to publish, people working through what's going on right now?
I mean, there's a bit of there's kind of multiple timelines, because there are things that I'm receiving that we had discussed, the contributor and I had discussed 5 or 6 months ago when a book was announced, right? And so they've been thinking about it for a long time, and you get their draft, and somehow it's still crept in. And then there's also the stuff that people are pitching me right now, and it's all, in a way, it's all the same. So many people wanting to process this moment. And so there's the fear that it's all just, you're going to just be painting an entire issue with the same brush. But at the same time, everyone's different. And like what Stephanie was talking about is connecting to a writer their point of view and their reality, and that's different for all of us, right? And so it's kind of there's the tension to say, oh, we have enough COVID-19 stuff, and then there's the other reality of we're actually documenting this moment. That are we writing these pieces for our contemporaries right now, or are we writing these pieces for the scholars and the novelists 50 years from now that are trying to make sense of something that happened today, right? And so I think you kind of have to like balance that line and hope for the best, hope for something that is meaningful for people while we're all stuck in our houses, trying to read something interesting.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, of course.
I think it's just what Kyle just said. The final criteria has to be something that's interesting. I mean, I would keep on reading about COVID. Let's say if it's to Stephanie's point, if it's Joan Didion on COVID, I want to know what's going on in Joan Didion's thinking life right now, because I'll read Joan Didion writing about a phone book. I mean, I really like her work, right? Whereas that kind of the spread, the infection of our reading and our writing plans by COVID is just too much. So that I think, I don't know, it might have been the latest issue of the New Yorker, but it might as well have been any literary magazine. I think I just glazed over because it just seemed to me like report after report where if there isn't a COVID hook, it seems to me that it's necessary. I think eventually I found it was Anthony Grant's review of Cheryl Misak, one of our colleagues at the University of Toronto, of her new book, a biography. That was great because it had nothing to do with COVID whatsoever. So it was a kind of my reading of the New Yorker was a framed experience of, if it's well written, I'll read about COVID for hours on end. If it's not well written, if it's not interesting, if it's not saying something new, the other thing that you bring up, Kyle, speaks in many ways to the kind of work I think that Kate and Stephanie do, and it is the question of the future archive. I was chatting with, I believe, fellow Massey Senior Fellow Melanie Wooden, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science and a professor of cell and systems biology at U of T, about this very question right now about, what does it mean for us to try to understand our present moment in looking ahead? How can we serve future scholars, writers, ethnographers, economists with the kind of archive? So it might be, a project we might pursue with students and faculty in the months ahead to figure out what it looks like as a way to kind of build out of this present moment in ways that would be we could imagine as useful to us in our current processing, to Stephanie's earlier point, but then also, meaningful looking ahead. I say that because I was thinking the other day, I wonder what U of T was like in 1918, 1919, the so-called Spanish flu epidemic. And wouldn't it be great if we could find some archival evidence of how students, faculty, staff, alumni, how people lived out that moment, and then juxtaposition to think through what we saw then versus now, and then looking ahead, alas, to the next version of this, and hopefully it'll be 100 years. Those sorts of moments, I think, will be made possible by good writing, no matter what, and our imaginations will stay there. I think there's going to be an eye roll when there'll be probably a COVID baby boom at some point, and then there's going to be like a COVID publishing at some point, right, of COVID novels that are doing too much with this present moment, and we'll get sick of it and we'll move on. But there will be a great book in there or two, and people will remember those.
I think it's hard to tell what's going to be the great book, right? Was it Norway? The National Museum in Norway has asked every citizen to record what they did on whatever date. Everyone, the same date during COVID, please record what you did that day. And they're asking every citizen to do it and to send it in so that they can capture the moment. And they were interviewing the archivist on the media last week, and the archivist made the point of they need to collect all of these testimonies so that they can understand what was going on, but it's far too premature to collect the archives that will then support the moment, because they don't know what people actually think are important yet. and we won't know what's actually important. Is it the mask?
Right.
Is it the hand sanitizer? Or is it the grocery store where you can talk to people again? We don't know the physicality of what's going to be important in this moment for the future yet, because we don't know what it's important to us yet.
Well, and in that sense, that's why that's the kind of intergenerational connection that, in its way, Massey creates, but then also that we would create with doing this properly, where we create the conditions for someone to kind of reveal that for future readers, etc. And artists and critics in the meantime might be able to kind of light things up a little bit more, to identify or become kind of those the first draft moments, as it were, to kind of riff on the definition of journalism. That's, I think, what we could try to do together and individually in this moment. It's great to know about the Norway example. That's great.
Yeah. I think if I can just make one comment about imaginative distancing that I thought of when everyone's been talking, and it's kind of the where I personally do my reading for pleasure is not where I do my work, and suddenly I'm doing my work in the space at home where I usually read for pleasure, or I'm not able to go to the coffee shop where I read for pleasure, or we can't go to our park bench. We can't, there's been this conflation in a lot of ways because our homes have been kind of carved up into multiple offices and multiple workspaces for if you live with a partner who also is working from home. It's a strange moment where you kind of have to you have to demand the time so that you can actually do that imaginative distancing, because it's quite easy to let it slip away, and you have to reimagine your space for that reflection.
If I could just speak directly to that point, it speaks in many ways to the permanent problem of being, let's say, a graduate student in the humanities. In that, usually graduate students in the humanities, I take your point very much about the coffee shop, etc. I would add to that commuting, right? Subway reading. You lose all that reading time, or if you listen, to an audible version of something. But I found in graduate school, I got to a point where I hated reading, because, to your point, Kyle, that's all you do all day long.
Because it's your job.
Then you go home, and what do? You read more. And I thought this became very, very troubling to me, that this very thing that I love so many ways was now being kind of destroyed by the very thing. So my way out of that was I made the decision that I would always have on my bedside table something purposefully useless, something I could never teach, write about, be inspired by with my own work, and nothing. Just this can have a protected reading in some ways, right? And I think that sensibility has to stay with us now, even if, as you say, we're stuck at home, we have partners around us, there's nowhere else to kind of go. I think it's still identifying something. I don't care whether it's COVID related or related to a history of arthropods, whatever it is, just something that you've intentionally protected from everything else, right? Your mask, as it were, right? Your imaginative mask. Yeah. I think having that is a way to get through this.
Thank you so much. So we have some questions and comments coming in. The first one we have is from our principal, Natalie, and she is saying, I am interested in the idea of documenting the moment. Is that a usual feeling in our diaries that we all want distraction? Sorry, I'm just, I want into COVID and I want all out of COVID. So talking more about the idea of recording this moment and maybe sort of usual ways of recording versus kind of, as you were describing, Kyle, with Norway, sort of an extraordinary effort to record something in the sense of this is a kind of extraordinary time. How do those two things come into play here? Sorry, I've lost the question.
I think that
one.
Oh, go ahead.
Do we see? No, go ahead. No, go ahead, Kyle, please.
I think that one of the things that, this isn't really getting at the question directly, but one of the things that strikes me is the kind of, when I get all the pieces from an issue, and I get them all together, everyone wants to contextualize the pandemic in their own way. They all want to say like the COVID-19 pandemic or the novel, and there's almost this sense that like we're past contextualization. We don't have to remember with that context anymore. We can just say the crisis or the pandemic, right? Like when we're in the middle of remembering, we can start relying more on pronoun, on synonyms and pronoun. Like we don't need to say the entire thing anymore. Like I think that's where I find myself in kind of putting together examples of memory, is that we can just be in the moment, and we can be in the moment just with our language too. We don't have to define COVID-19 in every opening paragraph anymore, because it's so, we'll never forget it. No one will ever look at something published in 2020 and say, well, what crisis were they talking about? You know what I mean? Like it's clear now, I think. I don't know if that's a question.
That's a great way to put it. That's a great way to put it. And I think it does speak to Natalie's query about just what does it mean, this desire to document and make sense of. I mean, it's very natural. Human means, I think here's where I turn to the fiction writers. Lionel Trilling, the great New York critic, famously described the great thing you get out of a novel is the hum and buzz of implication. The hum and buzz of implication. And when we get to that moment when someone's written a good story or a good novel about this moment, it'll be somebody who's figured out how to use the word Zoom in a way that captures how normalized, just to your point about how we now know what we're referring to without having to use the full term. Just think 6 months ago about the word Zoom and what it would mean to all of us in discourse 6 months ago, right? Or mask, like if you could just take 2 or 3 words and or objects, and how completely loaded and freighted with implication they are now. What does it mean to kind of use those, deploy them, explore with them in a light way that normalizes? Like I'm thinking, the one thing that my wife and I keep doing as a kind of exercise is we keep trying to imagine how our kids will explain this to their grandchildren. Remember that weird 6-month moment when none of us went to school? Remember that weird 6-year moment when, looking ahead, what will they remember and in their lived experiences document? I had another friend who pointed out, that kind of old cliche about Depression era impacts on people, the people who hoard cans of food, let's say, the grandparents who hoard cans of food, whatever it would be. What's our version of that? Is it going to be the toilet paper? Is it going to be the hand sanitizer? But what are the ways that our own practices, our daily practices as thinking persons and acting persons, believing persons, how will we behave 10 years from now that demonstrates we're still kind of impacted by COVID, by the effect of the pandemic? I think that to know that is going to be partly demonstrated by what we've decided to document, what we do think is really important now.
But and it's an interesting sort of tension in the archive between, as you're saying, the things that are implication, the things that we at this moment feel we don't need to fully define anymore because it's so present in everything that's surrounding us. As Cal said, you don't need to explain what COVID-19 is in the first paragraph of every essay you write. But then when that becomes part of the archive, and as people look at that from a historical distance, how that implication and how those kind of understandings, and as you're saying, like all the meaning that's around the word Zoom at the moment, how that'll last in that archive or not. I read a lot of, in my own work, 18th century letters and diaries. And something that this has made me just increasingly aware of is what are those implications, what are those unspoken things that are in there that I'm not picking up at my historical distance? And then again, pieces of that work, of that record, of those diaries, to come back to Natalie's question about record keeping and making diaries, that are kind of jumping off the page to me in new ways. So, for example, all of the reports of the huge ongoing smallpox epidemics in Britain in the 18th century, and the huge role that that played in people's lives. And those were kind of sections of those letters that previously I might have just kind of read past because it's not, I thought, as sort of directly related to what I'm doing. But now I feel like I have a little sense of some of that implication. It kind of, to go back to some of the language, it sort of hums to me in a different way now.
But it's more than that, though, right? The other reason why you're looking past it isn't because you're writing your dissertation and looking for something, but also because the 18th century smallpox epidemic in Britain isn't part of the official narrative of 18th century Britain in a way that's publicly available. Certainly it would be to specialists in the field, but there's no reason to engage it. It's not a defining feature of the 18th century. Maybe the Enlightenment comes to mind more immediately, or if we just think about the kind of the major things that were happening, let's say in the 18th century, the precursor, the French Revolution, all those big building blocks. Epidemic doesn't fit. I was reading an article. I was just predicted that we have new questions, so maybe we could go to those before I turn to something else I was going to say. Kate.
Sure, thank you. So this from the Canadian Business History Association. Has the situation altered the relative interest by subject matter of your reading, writing / work? For example, history, sci-fi, biography, fiction, nonfiction, etc. Are we reading different things now than before this?
Kyle?
I think I'm escaping in a way that you were describing that the novel you just reviewed that was in 2009 or whatever, right? I'm escaping to kind of early 20th century, 19th century history, because kind of how it ends. Like I just read a biography of Teddy Roosevelt, and it's satisfying in a way that almost like reality TV or a formulaic sitcom satisfying is that how it's going to end. There's an arc and you're going to get to it, and so it doesn't feel so difficult. So in my own reading, I'm going to things that I can reliably know that have a tidy ending. In a way that when I was writing my dissertation, I found real pleasure in kind of cheap, bad television, because it was like a roller coaster. It would take you up and it would take you down, and you would know exactly how it would end. And, there's stories like Abraham Lincoln turning to dime novels during the Civil War, because for the same reasons, it was a form of entertainment, but it was also a form of therapy, and that you knew that it would have a resolution. So I think in my own reading, I'm looking for things that have tidy resolution right now, because we live in a moment where there is no resolution. We can't even plan we can't plan summer vacation. We can't plan when we're going to see our friends again. We can't plan a dinner. So what can you rely on? That's, I think, what I turn to.
I would say that just to the question, anywhere I look, let's say in the categories that were described, whether it's sci-fi or biography, you're looking either for or problem as it were, right? You're overwhelmed already, or you're wondering. I think I saw a recent new science fiction novel that sounded interesting, and then I had this moment where I thought, well, maybe there's going to be some kind of plague related thing in it, and I don't want to read that. But I will say this: here's my refuge. Just speaking to Kyle's very beautiful reflection there. I'm reading Middlemarch right now. And every 5 years since I was an undergrad at U of T, I have reread Middlemarch, because the professor I had then, Professor Henry Oster from the English department, who was an Eliot scholar, when he first gave us the novel, he said, he was so happy for us because this is the kind of novel that you can read for the rest of your life. And every time you read it, you'll see the world in a different way, because Middlemarch is built as this kind of full and immersive experience seen from all these different perspectives, from people at different points in their lives. And so you identify with Fred Vinci, and maybe you identify with Rosamond at one point, maybe you identify with all sort of eventually, whatever, God forbid, whatever it would be, right? And so I'm finding that that is very durable and completely protects me from everything else I'm describing. It's my nighttime reading right now. I'm reading it very pleasurably that way.
I'd say just one more thing about how my reading is different, and that's reading as an editor of other people's work is different in that I am hyper aware of words like mask and words like the book is plagued with problems.
Sure.
Right? So like the words that we would use without even thinking 6 months ago that suddenly have a different meaning, and those words jump out and thinking like, is it an overreaction to suggest a synonym or a rephrasing? Because is it insensitive to say something is plagued right now when it has nothing to do with the pandemic, right? So those are reading words in a different way than I've ever read them before. Specific words.
Thank you. I think we have one question. This is from Amy Cote. Hi, Amy. She says, I'm wondering what the panelists would say to those of us who find the sustained attention required by reading somewhat beyond us right now. I've been stuck on page 100 of Mantel's new book for 6 weeks.
I think that's what we're supposed to say, Netflix and chill, no? I mean, I'm finding that I'm watching the ESPN Netflix documentary about the Chicago Bulls, The Last Dance. It's this grand, over-the-top, ridiculous, and decadent, 12-part series or something on one final season of the Chicago Bulls with Michael Jordan. And it's a alternative, obviously, to sports, but it has nothing to do with anything else in a way. And I have found myself sometimes kind of caught between a Michael Jordan documentary and George Eliot. Phrase I never thought I would say. And maybe, Amy, turning to something visual as until you get sick of it and then realize, my God, I want to go back to Mantel or something else might be a way to deal with that challenge.
I haven't read it yet, but I've had a couple of people reference that that there is a moment around page 100 that takes a while to break through, but once you break through, it gets better. But I think that in general, in life in general, but especially in a moment like this, there's too much great stuff to read in the world. So if it's not for work, or if it's not for school, or if it's not for a specific research purpose, I'm of the belief that if a book doesn't capture you, it's okay to put it aside and to find another book that will, because there's more than any of us can ever read. So don't spend your time reading something that doesn't engage you.
That's very well said. I can't help but affirm that very point. In other words, with so many great stories out there, there is a way to preserve our imaginative distancing for all the very good reasons that we've been discussing today.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And maybe that's a good place to finish up today. I want to say thank you so much to our panel for joining us. Unfortunately, Stephanie seems to have been dropped from the call, so I'm sorry that we haven't been able to hear from her in these questions. But thank you very much for being here. Thank you to everyone for watching, to the college for putting together this series, to Matt for his technical help. You can go to the Massey College website or the Twitter for information about upcoming Massey Dialogues, and all of the previous dialogues are available to watch on the Massey YouTube channel. Thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Be well. Take care. Read good books.